Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. One of the things that we in the black media told you was that even after the Supreme Court's affirmative action ruling, which was actually more legislation being passed than anything else, we would still see Asians unhappy about the situation, because this entire racist enterprise wasn't about fixing anything. Everyone who was involved in this understood that fact full well from the jump, and all it was about was attacking black students in specific, but black people in general. That's it. And a number of the non-white people who were acting as frontmen for this operation, they knew what its true purpose was. The white supremacists have long used non-white front people like Dinesh D'Souza and Candace Owens to act as their frontmen for their anti-black operations. In many cases, these people of color front persons are paid by these white supremacist think tanks. This was what they did when presenting their case against affirmative action to a Supreme Court that had been front-loaded with Federalist Society shills, all of whom had publicly pledged that they would strike down affirmative action first chance they got, no matter what the legal merits of the case. You've heard of buyer's remorse? But what we're seeing is liar's remorse. Some people are starting to realize the racist operatives who put them up to things like attacking black people by proxy were also getting them to act against their own self-interest. Now, we in the black grassroots have said from the very beginning that this affirmative action ruling wouldn't make things better for Asians at all, because practically no black students benefit from affirmative action in college admissions. And now we're seeing that even though the ink has barely dried on the Supreme Court's ruling, Asians are voicing all these other concerns that have nothing to do with black student enrollment at all. Of course, the anti-affirmative action crusade didn't help Asians, even though that's what the white right-wing forces claimed it would do. It could never help Asians because it was never meant to. What happened was there were some folks who thought that they were scoring points with the dominant society by going along with this. Some people thought that it would make them allies with the white power structure, but it didn't. Historically, we keep seeing this pattern play itself out over and over. Japan allied itself with Germany, but despite some phony praise from Hitler, it didn't change how the Nazis saw them. Later, the Japanese would ally themselves with the Americans, but that didn't change how white supremacists in the US saw them either. China allied itself with Russia, but despite some phony praise, it didn't change how the Russians saw them. They keep trying the same game and getting the same results. These organizations and white think tanks put out so-called books claiming to acknowledge Asians' academic excellence, especially outperforming white students. But that was propaganda on their part, because what they usually did was say, well, the fact that we admit that Asians outperform white students on standardized tests means that all of our anti-black rhetoric isn't really racist. They weren't actually singing the praises of Asian students. What they were doing was using Asians as a smokescreen for the same old anti-black racism. Now, if that's the case, if they actually meant what they said about Asian students, then why is it that not one of these white right-wing organizations have Asians as the leaders of their groups? After all, it's all about merit, right? And they want the best, right? And they're colorblind, right? For these white right-wing think tanks, Asians are good enough to be their spokespeople, but never good enough to be their leaders. We'll get into that in a minute, but back to the school admissions piece. Part of the white media's propaganda on this is the repetition of the phrase, seen as deserving. They keep using that word over and over again. To be seen as deserving. Seen as deserving? By whom? Who do they want to be seen as deserving by? Whose approval are they looking for? Who are they trying to impress? Because you have never heard of any of these white legacy admission students like George Bush or any of the myriad of others saying that they want to be seen as deserving by anyone. When white students' families buy them a seat in these universities, not one of them talks about wanting to be seen as deserving. In fact, it's out of sight, out of mind. They could care less whether or not you know that it was their family connections and their white money that got them in and nothing else. As far as they're concerned, who cares if you think they deserved it or not? They got it, and that's all that mattered to them. And the white media is not about to call them out on it, because a ton of them who you see presenting the news to you, these white studio executives and producers, and the ones who own these white media networks, they are themselves beneficiaries of those legacy admissions. They could care less what anyone has to say, because they know that under white supremacy, being classified as white means they don't have to care who thinks that they deserve it or not. As Abraham Lincoln said, he would see the superior position assigned to the white race. As for white society, they don't talk about deserving anything because their skin color is what qualifies them as deserving. This is the real affirmative action, the one that nobody talks about because it is the largest and longest standing affirmative action program in human history. And with it, they are granted the seats in the top universities, guaranteed positions in top companies handed to them not because of qualifications or experience, but solely because of race. And no stigma is ever applied to it, because to attach a stigma to something that disproportionately benefits those classified as white would be to attach a stigma to whiteness itself. The white supremacists who have attacked black people by falsely claiming black people get school admissions they shouldn't get or jobs they don't deserve are themselves the very same unqualified white legacy students and white employees who get jobs because of the old boy network. Those are the largest affirmative action programs that have ever existed. But nobody files lawsuits to stop those truly harmful and damaging policies from taking place, at least not any of these white right-wing organizations who are just so hot and bothered due to the tsunami of undeserving and untalented black students who are just flooding these universities and taking them over. Nobody makes it a point to attach a social stigma to any of it. There's so many in white society who derive tangible benefits every moment of every day from whiteness. Why would anyone speak against it? To indict the legacy admissions or to make a crusade out of stigmatizing people who get their jobs due to their social, racial connections would also mean indicting the 1001 ways that white supremacy bestows tangible benefits on those classified as white. So instead of getting angry about it, they just shrug and say, well, that's just the effect of money, that's what it's about. It puts a thumb on the scales and what can you do? It's so dangerous for them to even talk about it because of what the implications are for the rest of them that they brush it off as being merely about class and not race and hurry away before the conversation goes any further. A lot of Asians wound up being deceived because they bought into the phony praise that you had these white right-wing organizations heaping on them, at least in the initial wake of the Supreme Court's decision. The initial sugar rush of seeing headlines saying that Asians score higher on college admissions tests wore off pretty quick, and the political hangover has begun. Slowly but surely, some Asians are beginning to see what black people have said all along, that they were sold a bill of goods, but don't let anyone ever say that they were lied to. They weren't. This pack of lies was sold with their eyes wide open. Those individuals who you saw standing with Ed Blum, they intentionally overlooked how they're discriminated against by these white corporations and that there's no black people for them to scapegoat. But if they knew that there's not enough black students to impact how many Asians would get admitted into Harvard or Yale or wherever, then why did they even go along with it? What was the true goal then? That's what this affirmative action nothing burger represented to a lot of people. A way for them to ingratiate themselves with the white power structure, a way for them to show how dedicated they are to team white supremacy and get some sort of social promotion or social upgrade out of it. It was the exact same motivation that led to Peter Liang, the ruthless killer in New York, getting so much across the nation's support. This is about access to social circles. It's about being part of the in crowd, or at least being in their orbit. Many Asian Americans played along with the white right's anti-black scheme, but none of them stopped to ask why those same white right-wing operatives say nothing when Silicon Valley firms disproportionately have Asians as their workforce, and yet Asians are not the majority of management in any of those companies. In fact, in many cases, Asians aren't even a significant number of management. When crusading against black students on university campuses or black employees at a job site, these white right-wing operatives will say that Asians outperform white people on standardized testing, and hey, since we're honest enough to admit that, what that means is we're not really racist at all. We wouldn't have a problem with Asians being the majority at universities or corporations because to us, it's all about merit. But when we look at what these white right-wingers actually do, they racially discriminate all day long against Asians. Asians make up nearly half the workforce at Meta, but they're only about a quarter of the executives. Meanwhile, white people are only 39% of the employees at Meta, but they make up nearly 60% of the executives. So we see the racism in Mark Zuckerberg's little pigsty is hardly limited to anti-black racism. At Cisco Systems, it's even worse. Asians are 60% of that company's workforce, but only 15% of its executives. Lumentum, a company that makes fiber optical equipment, their workforce is 60% Asian, but only 15% of senior executives are Asians. On a side note, this USA Today piece that I'm quoting from, which came out only 4 days ago, right after the affirmative action ruling, and yet doesn't mention affirmative action in the piece at all. They don't make any sort of connection there, though that's the entire thing that motivated this piece. It does, however, mention that some of the Asians at these companies used the murder of George Floyd to give them momentum to start having courageous conversations about race. But the Asians didn't want to talk about racist police brutality. They wanted to talk about why they're the majority of the workforce at these companies, but only a handful of the executives. The guy who set up the Employee Resources Group at Lumentum to discuss workplace discrimination was later chided as making white people feel bad. Predictably, Lumentum fired him soon thereafter. This is what's going on in America's corporations when it comes to the treatment of Asians, and it's been going on for decades now at these white-owned corporations. This is the real Asian discrimination going on, but it gets buried. Well, I guess that's because they're not competent enough, right? They don't work hard enough, right? They just don't have the natural leadership skills or creativity, right? But where's the white media feeding frenzy over this is what I want to know. Oh, but it's all about merit, the white right tells us. My question is, are we going to be seeing Asians taking to the streets and blaming black employees or blaming school admissions policies for this? See, this is the reality that nobody's talking about. What I want to know is, where's Dinesh D'Souza at now for this issue, something that actually does affect Asians? Where's Vivek Ramaswamy at? Or Michelle Malkin? Or Amy Chua? Or any of the bought and paid for racist liars who we usually see attacking black people? Here you have actual cases of Asians being targeted and repressed, not phony made up fairy tales like what it was that Ed Blum was saying. Asians who are clearly superior over their white counterparts at these corporations and yet are targeted to be held back through a blatant and open and illegal system of racial discrimination, and yet none of these white rights mouthpieces like Dinesh D'Souza or any of the others say a word. The Asians who normally get airtime have never said a word about this, and they're not going to. Because keeping attention off of white employer discrimination is what people like Ramaswamy, D'Souza, Malkin, and Chua were hired to do. This is what their job is. And to show art imitates strife, you don't see any of these Asian mouthpieces for these white racist think tanks ever being made leader of any of them. Dinesh D'Souza runs nothing but his mouth. Vivek Ramaswamy is running for president, but that's as close as the white right's going to let him come to running anything. Michelle Malkin, same thing. Amy Chua, same thing. The white right has no problem letting these Asian front people sell the lies for them, but they'll be damned if they're going to take orders from them. So whether it's Silicon Valley companies on the left or conservative race mongers on the right, we see the same policies across the board where Asian accomplishments on paper don't translate into Asians being in charge of anything. And part of the reason that they can't get any sort of momentum for this is there's no black people for them to attack. See, this is what the dynamic becomes when there's no black people to shoehorn into the situation. You just can't get any traction. That shows you what it's really about. Now, what's required here is that Asians are going to have to start speaking out against all of this anti-Asian racism coming from these white supremacists. The dynamic that's been set up until now is, let's go ahead and leverage some sort of poking the stick at black people or pointing the dirty into the stick at black people, and that's going to hopefully translate into some momentum. That's not going to be the case. This is going to come down to having to face these white supremacists down. There will be no getting around that. Playing along with these phony white grievance hustlers like Ed Blum and others is what enables the Metas, the Ciscos, and the Lumentums to carry out their anti-Asian policies. They certainly couldn't do it in a media or legal environment where people were actually laser-focused on exposing them. And will we see racists in the white media using the stupid, tired lie that they use to explain why black men are the majority of the NBA and NFL's workforce, but have practically no executive positions? Are they going to drag that one out and say, well, Asians got jobs and that's enough? Why, there's plenty of Asians represented when you look at who it is who's hired there, so that's enough. Are they going to try that one? Of course not. But as usual, when white supremacy is done with its tools, they break their tools. Now, what hopefully could come out of this is that at least some Asians will now realize that playing along with white supremacy is not some victimless crime. White supremacy always uses the exact same MO for those it wants to make into its accomplices. Doesn't matter if it's in Africa or in the Americas or if it was with the Jews in Germany. It flatters its targets with false praise initially, telling them that they're smarter than those other people over there. And when it comes to colonization, the white supremacists have no problem telling their would-be puppets that they're smarter than members of their own race. And then, having gassed their heads up, white supremacy has their puppets do their dirty work, and in the end, it leaves the tool out in the cold. And predictably, the tools will complain, and they remind the white supremacists, hey, what about all that talk about how we were better than so-and-so? What about all that praise that you used to give us? But it all falls on deaf ears. White supremacy is not sentimental about its tools, any more than a mechanic is sentimental about a pair of pliers. When the pliers break, or no longer are doing the job, no mechanic even attempts to fix them. They just immediately throw them out and get another pair. They don't care how long the tool was useful or how much money it made for them. All that matters is what they want, and the instant the tool is no longer expedient for that purpose, it gets discarded without hesitation or regret. White supremacy is about lying for fun and profit. All that phony outrage over school admissions policy was astroturf, pushed by wealthy white racists who want to use it as a starting point for a larger, broader attack on black people throughout the society. And when we look at these white companies, we see what they truly have in mind. Because as long as we're distracted with the phony outrage of black people, nobody's talking about these mega-billion-dollar corporations who literally control the world by controlling the flow of information and what people focus their attention on. When you look at these white-owned corporations like Meta, Cisco, and Lumentum, you see the meritocracy that they want. Meritocracy that has complete and thorough equality of outcome, but only for those classified as white. Everybody else, doesn't matter how valuable you are, how much merit you are, how much you've done, how qualified you are, you're relegated to the bottom, and that's that. A legacy hiring and legacy promotions program, the real affirmative action, which is white privilege. And when white media outlets like USA Today piggyback off of how a number of Asians helped to engineer the striking down of affirmative action, but refuse to mention that Supreme Court ruling in their article, then they're part of the problem. How can you talk about Asians being discriminated against in white companies only a few days after talking about Asians allegedly being discriminated against in college admissions? The only reason USA Today ran this piece is because it was seen as timely. And we all know why, though they don't dare say it. They don't want to connect those dots because when they do, we all know where it will lead. People have to walk on eggshells at these white media companies merely to even talk about part of the problem. But they don't dare show how it all ties together. They don't have the courage. Well, that's why you need the black media. When people push the white supremacist line, they better start figuring out that it won't be long before they themselves get pushed out. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Nicholas Moore, Melvinia Miles, Endoro Emblem, Anthony Pollard, and NaG95. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.